There are many times in one's life when you find yourself standing against the current. That's when you realize that following the pack was never actually good for you. We are a channel outcasts and outlaws, patriots and rebels. We are here to breathe the American dream back to life, and to prove to the world that Generation Z is truly capable of the change so many ascribe to it. My name is Icarus, and this is the Plead the Fifth podcast. Hey, what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast.
Yep, nice to have you guys back.
Today we're going to be going over some interesting things that have been happening recently in the United States railroad industry. But before we get to that, I would like to talk a little bit about some recent events like we normally do. Some interesting stuff has happened in this world that we like to call home. So, first thing that happened, not today, but happened recently, was the defeat of Mayor Lori Lightfoot. She had been the mayor of Chicago since 2019 and was originally actually elected in a landslide victory, and she won all 50 wards of the city. During COVID, Chicago had a massive crime spike, and homicides and shootings went way up, like ridiculously up. They've actually come down since then, since 2020. But the burglaries, thefts, and robberies have increased in those same years, and that's from the New York Times. But, you know, it is Chicago, so I don't know really what you expect.
Very safe place.
I've been to Chicago once in my entire life, and let me tell you, the nickname that they give it, Chirac, is the most accurate. Like, I felt in danger. The first thing that I got asked when I went into that city, first interaction I had with a Chicagoan was, hey, you got a cigarette? Like, that was my first interaction with a person from that city. So
honestly, terrible place. The pizza's not even good. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Chicagoans. Your pizza sucks.
I don't mean this as a personal attack or anything.
No, I mean it as a personal attack.
Yeah, fair enough. They deserve it. There's enough personal attacks going on in Chicago anyway.
That's also true. Many of the people in Chicago, obviously because of this increase in crime, were questioning their actual personal safety. You know, I question my personal safety just walking outside, but, you know, that's just me. So that severely impacted Lori's campaign. And two alternative candidates came out, Paul Vallis and Brandon Johnson. So Vallis is a conservative. He calls for hard-on-crime policy, increased police funding, and a crisis management strategy. Meanwhile, Johnson calls for a more left-leaning policy, which focuses on stopping the city's mental health crisis. And he originally actually said he wanted to decrease police funding, but he's backtracked on that because, you know, that's not a very popular opinion at the current moment. Yeah. To be honest, what do you think? Who has the better platform here?
I'd go with Vallis, but I mean, it's too early to tell.
Yeah, that's true.
We kind of just have to see how they handle crisis. I mean,
to be honest, I would go for both of their policies.
Yeah.
Like,
if you can implement both.
I think they need to improve mental health in that city. The entirety of America has a mental health issue.
We do have a mental health crisis right now.
But we also need to, right now, focus on fixing the crime problem, which involves being hard on crime. We cannot be soft on criminals. We can't do that.
Lightfoot's whole platform was basically to ignore it.
Ignore it and it'll go away and we'll be fine.
I don't know if you saw it, too. This isn't in the script, but Lori Lightfoot blames election on racism, gender. Definitely not any of her platforms or policies.
I know she actually ran on the fact that she was the first, I believe, black woman to be elected in Chicago as mayor, and the first outly expressing gay person to be elected.
Oh, is she gay too?
Yeah, she's gay.
I didn't even know that. Thing. That's crazy.
So that
all the boxes.
You know, it kind of explains to me why she would blame it on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with her identity. It's just she was a terrible candidate. You can't blame that.
Yeah, no, you can't blame your own inadequacy on the fact that people are, you know, whatever name you want to give them. Yeah. As we, you know, went over on our last episode.
Yeah.
And I believe you had a section on this next part.
Oh, yeah. Biden visits Ukraine. It was a momentous occasion. He traveled to Kiev back in a couple weeks ago. We're a little late on this.
Yeah.
But to meet with Zelensky, air raid sirens blaring, despite the fact that we already warned Russia like 24 hours beforehand.
Yeah, that was a little
I don't know
sketchy.
If that was a PR thing or if it was just like a general warning for the entire area. But
he reaffirmed American support for Ukraine.
Yep, that's our.
You know, as if the billions,
number one priority. Right?
The billions of dollars didn't do anything. Like, you know, that didn't reaffirm support whatsoever.
Yeah, he emphasized that there was a broad bipartisan support in Washington for the Ukrainian cause, which honestly, it's probably true. I don't know about bipartisan support in America, but in Washington it definitely seems
Yeah,
like it.
Washington and America are two different
Those are
places.
two very different fields of opinion, but yeah, it's kind of just it was pretty hypocritical, honestly, from the right and the left, sort of, because I mean we have the left wing going all in on interventionism, which they've complained about for the past 40 years, and we have the right arguing that we should stay away from Ukraine when we've been war hawks for the past.
This is the thing
40
is,
years.
like, the left didn't want us to fight the terrorists that attacked us personally in the Middle East, but the right didn't want to fight Ukraine when they've been anti-Russia this whole time, which is what I find hilarious.
Yeah. In practice, I think both ends of the American political spectrum are way too interventionist.
Oh, that's
we have no business being in Ukraine right now when we have our own disasters going on. That's a decent segue into East Palestine. We're back with that.
Oh yeah,
2 weeks in a row. It was that big of a disaster.
I mean, it's the biggest. I don't really care about the environment. In case you hadn't, you couldn't tell, but it's like the biggest disaster in modern U.S. history, other than 9/11. Yeah, and it's been a month since the Norfolk Southern train derailed, carrying hazardous chemicals. You know, if you didn't listen to our last episode, we did a little bit of a dive on that. Some of the cars in the contest were carrying vinyl chloride, which is a substance known to cause headaches, dizziness, liver damage, and cancer. You know, all the great things. And on March 3rd, the officials of Ohio released the results of a questionnaire which was given to the residents of East Palestine. And out of 168 responses, 125 of them, or 74% of residents, reported headaches. 108 or 64% of residents reported anxiety. 103 or 61% of residents reported coughing. 97 or 58% of residents reported fatigue or tiredness. And 88 or 52% of residents reported irritation, pain, or burning of the skin. I don't know about you guys, but that sounds like a completely safe town to me.
Yeah, it's fine. Also, 43,000 fish and other aquatic life were killed by the runoff of the chemicals. So it's not just a placebo. Oh, they're feeling bad. No, there's legitimately
toxins in the environment.
Yeah.
There's also the removal plan, which is just that was awful. So 3.2 million gallons of wastewater has been removed from the site and trucked elsewhere to be disposed of by deep well injection, which is essentially just what it means, like injecting the water deep underground, which will not come back to bite us in the butt later. That will not happen.
No shot.
And it's also been shipped to Texas and Michigan, which I believe I saw something that the governors of those states were not made aware of the fact that the waste was being transported into their states beforehand, which is, just great.
Didn't they send it to Detroit?
Yeah, they did.
Doesn't
they did
Detroit have enough problems as is?
Oh my god. 1,700 tons of solid waste was removed and taken to Indiana and Ohio for incineration. And all this is from Cleveland.com. First of all, we already tried incinerating one thing, and that led to the giant black cloud in the sky. Maybe we shouldn't be incinerating more of these things. That's just my personal opinions.
Yeah. Either way, though, it just kind of speaks volumes about where the priorities of the administration are. I mean, East Palestine, it's like the American heartland. It's regular working class people who are living on like American land that's been American for like hundreds of years. That should be like the primary course of action. Should be protecting them. But no, Biden's off in Ukraine.
Yeah, no. My full support for the people of Ukraine in fighting your war, but your emphasis is on your war. It's not ours. We need to be focusing. It's not about being anti-Ukraine. I am not anti-Ukraine.
Yeah.
I am pro-America. I want Biden as president to be in East Palestine helping those people.
Yeah. I want what's best for the average American citizen. I think that's a pretty good summation of our platform.
So this kind of continued rail-related disaster is just kind of one of 11,000 such derailments that happen every single year. This one just happened to make the news because it was carrying, toxic material.
Yeah, but more destructive than usual.
Usually they're not that destructive. So Norfolk Southern, as we talked about in our last episode, lobbied to stop regulation, which would have required special braking equipment for trains handling hazardous material. And this, of course, stemmed from a focus on maximizing profits while minimizing costs, which is common practice on U.S. Class 1 railroads, which is... Unfortunately. And by the way, for those of you not initiated, and in case you couldn't tell by the the title of this episode, this will be a deep dive on U.S. railroading, so I figured I would get some definitions out of the way. First of all, a U.S. Class 1 is defined as any railroad which generates more than $504 million a year, which was already... That's kicked up from, 10 years ago because... of inflation, obviously. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about in these kind of issues that have compounded and led to this crisis we're seeing now is positive train control, which is a system of interconnected technologies that are supposed to help prevent derailments and collisions and enforce speed limits and protect line-side workers, which actually works by telling a train where it's allowed to go, positive, as opposed to telling a train where it can't go, negative. And it was mandated by the FRA, or the Federal Railroad Administration, for all U.S. Class 1 railroads and Canadian ones that operate in U.S. Territories. So it was supposed to reduce these events, and yet actually in the first few years of existence, derailments still occur relatively regularly. And most experts actually argue that the technology isn't old enough yet to be adopted as a mandate. And I think this is just kind of another one of those things where the government's like, this will fix all of our problems, and they just do it. Don't question it.
It forces something, spends a lot of money on it. It has negligible effect.
Oh yeah,
and then you're kind of just left with the pieces.
The Class 1 spent billions of dollars investing in PTC, and the effect on actual safety has been minimal. PTC has not obviously didn't prevent East Palestine, even though the wayside detectors should have. And if you didn't watch our last episode, the reason that the train derailed was because of a hot bearing on one of the cars, and the wayside detector should have detected the hot bearing, but it didn't. And so here we are, PTC not helping whatsoever.
There you go.
But of course, this is not the only thing that has caused this crisis. The next thing would be precision scheduled railroading, which for any of you who are listening who are railroaders probably are groaning right now. As I said before, railroads attempt to maximize profits. And PSR was kind of a way of doing that, and it was introduced by E. Hunter Harrison during his time as the president of the Illinois Central Railroad, and has been adopted by pretty much every U.S. Class 1. There's a couple of them that have kind of abandoned it recently. I think CSX is one of those. PSR shifts the practices of how a railroad runs pretty much entirely. It removes this hub and spoke idea of trains, and removes unit trains, which are trains who all have one type of car. And this is in favor of point-to-point car operations and simplified networks. It's all a bunch of technical operating jargon I'm not going to get into. But freight trains operate now on fixed schedules like passenger trains do, instead of just waiting for enough cars to actually be loaded for a train to make sense. And intermodal trains, like container trains, are now being mixed with general freight instead of being separate. And it makes trains much longer and therefore much more dangerous, and you kind of get the gist. And the amount of cars, locomotives, and employees can be reduced for a specific amount of traffic level when you're operating under PSR, which, you're laying off employees and you're storing locomotives and you're storing cars. And this whole thing obviously allows for lower operational costs, but also affects safety, employee health, quality of service for smaller customers, and a bunch of other things. Negatively impacts all of them. Honestly, the main complaint from PSR has not even been the safety, it's been the fact that these railroads are providing terrible service to small customers. It's been awful. And it's also been linked to derailments, obviously, because, like I said, you're keeping these trains out on the road for longer, they're longer, there's, employee fatigue as being factored into it. It's just been a mess. And all this cost cutting has been linked to increasing focus on profit to investors, specifically for the Class 1s. And the Surface Transportation Board recently had a hearing about this lack of service that the Class 1s were providing. And when they asked why, because, the Class 1s today, they're making record profits, because, of course they are.
Naturally.
And why they were asked why they couldn't increase the quality of life for employees despite having these record profits. And you want to know what they responded with?
Real fun quote coming up.
Oh, yeah. So they said, the carriers maintain that the capital investment and risk are the reasons for their profits, not any contributions by labor. The carriers further agree that there is no correlation historically between high profits and higher compensation, either in the freight rail industry or more generally. To the contrary, one of the carrier's experts maintained that the most profitable companies are not those whose compensation is the highest. The carriers assert that since employees have been fairly and adequately paid for their efforts and do not share in the downside risks if the operations are less profitable, then they have no claim to share in the upside either. And that's from Trains Magazine. So,
that's rough.
Would you care to translate that?
Yeah. So essentially, there's no credit given to workers for basically running.
Yeah. Labor does not contribute to profit. That's essentially what they're saying. They're also saying that, despite the fact that when a railroad runs worse, workers can get laid off and don't get paid as much, they're basically denying that and basically saying workers get paid the same no matter how poorly the railroad is doing.
They're saying they have no investment in how successful the railroad is, which isn't true.
No, it's not true.
That's one of the industries where you can very easily get laid off if something happens.
Exactly. And this all kind of stems back to the railroad's adoption of the Friedman Doctrine.
We might have to do a deep dive on the Friedman Doctrine.
Yeah, that's
a hell of a mistake right there.
Yeah.
And it seems to be pretty widely adopted in most corporations, not just the railroad industry, but in general. A lot of corporations follow that.
Which say, the doctrine itself at the base level says a company has no social responsibility to the public or to society and is only responsible to its shareholders, which...
Yeah, wow, isn't that something?
It's in one of those weird, gray areas. Like you said, we're gonna have to do a full deep dive on that, specifically because it's a very controversial issue, and there's a lot of different. It applies well to some industries, but not very well to others. So the first thing is what do we even do about this situation? And a lot of railroad workers and left-leaning politicians, usually are calling for the nationalization of the rail system, which is that really the solution that we're going to go for? Because we've tried this before, actually, twice. You're probably familiar with one of them. Not the other one, maybe not so much. The one that you're probably less familiar with is Conrail, which stands for the Consolidated Railroad Corporation. So some background on this. In the 1970s, the Northeastern Railroad system was essentially non-existent, gone, kaput. Penn Central, which was the largest railroad in the country, had gone bankrupt in 1970, only 2 years after its creation from a merger of two railroads that were going bankrupt. You can kind of see where that was going. Yeah. And then Erie Lackawanna also went bankrupt due to the effects of Hurricane Agnes because it basically destroyed their entire railroad. And then once these two kind of fell apart, everything that relied on them also fell apart. And Conrail was formed by Congress to try and save at least part of these failed railroads. And the Rail Reorganization and Revitalization Act merged the majority of the Northeastern rail system into one government-funded body. And actually, unsurprisingly for our government, in the first 7 years, Conrail was highly unprofitable. It lost $2.2 billion from 1976 to 1982, despite being federally funded. How you do that with the amount of money they were pouring into it, it baffles me.
It's impressive.
And it finally actually began to improve under the leadership of L. Stanley Crane, who ran Conrail as, get this, a business and not a government entity. And the removal of regulation with the Staggers Rail Act, because go figure, when you remove regulation from an industry, it makes it better.
Generally.
That streamlined the operations and allowed them to actually turn a profit. In 1986, they were privatized and became a publicly traded company, and then they were broken up in 1998 between CSX and Norfolk Southern. And that has kind of gone downhill from there, as you've seen with the recent developments and what we've been talking about in this episode. And the second one, our listeners are probably more familiar with, and that is Amtrak. So Amtrak was formed in 1971 to take the burden of money-losing passenger rail from freight railroads, specifically the long-distance rail passenger trains, which had become unprofitable because the United States Postal Service removed the mail contracts from those trains, and that was pretty much all they were making money on. And it has never posted a profit in its entire existence, which is kind of depressing, considering the literature when it was created said specifically that it is to be a corporation and not owned by the government. That was the whole point, was it was supposed to become profitable, but it never did. And it was supposed to be short-term. The Nixon administration just kind of saw it as a way to give passenger trains a last hurrah and to boost their political standing because they were popular with people at the time. And proponents hoped that Amtrak would eventually become profitable. And like I said, neither of these things happened. Amtrak has been too popular for it to be removed and too not profitable enough to actually be privatized.
Yeah. So whenever the government seems to get involved in private business, long-term anyway, it always creates issues. Like the efficiency, the funding, host of other things.
Yeah, I think the issue is that our government is just not good at running a business. We have never been close to, our national debt has always been sky high.
Yeah, they don't post a profit because they're not designed to post a profit.
That's the problem is when you run a business, when something's supposed to be run like a business, like Amtrak was supposed to be run like a business, but it's not been run like a business. They had a revolving door of 15 different CEOs over the course of their existence, and they've never been able to post a profit. And then it's also been funding for Amtrak has been controversial. Some administrations will fund it, some won't, and it's they can never actually put enough money into Amtrak to actually make it profitable. That's why Conrail worked. Conrail got profitable because the government poured a bunch of money into it to try and make it privatized as quickly as possible.
They committed. They didn't just leave it around as a vestigial weird government corporation.
Yeah, quasi-corporation.
It's not quite corporatist, but it's also just kind of, it's just sitting there, basically.
Yeah.
It's just running on what we've already budgeted for it, and there's not going to be any increase or decrease besides whatever politicians' whim comes up to. Like,
I think
whatever's popular at the time.
The big issue is the fact that, like you said, it's not being run as a corporation. It's not being run as a branch of government. It's like this weird middle thing where it's too regulated to actually be able to change its practices to be able to post a profit, like
to make any money.
Something I've learned doing research is if Amtrak wanted to make a profit right now, they could abandon all their long-distance passenger trains and just run the Northeast Corridor in, from Washington, D.C. to New York City, and they would post a profit. Because what's losing the money is the long-distance trains, but the government's like, no, you have to keep those trains because they're important. And I agree that they're important because some people in those small towns in the middle of nowhere, that's their only way to get to work or whatever.
Yeah.
But, the Amtrak can't post a profit because they're too limited in their ability to actually change their operating, structure.
Yeah. So that kind of brings us to what an actual solution would look like. This is pretty speculative, but if you are going to go down the route of nationalizing railroads, it has to be very short term.
Yeah.
You nationalize them all at once, and you pump a good amount of money into them, and then break up these large corporations and monopolies.
Yeah, I think the example of what we don't want to do in this situation is British Rail. And if there's any British people listening, I'm sorry, but British Rail sucked.
Britain in general, honestly. I'm just not really a fan.
Oh my god. All right.
I'm sorry.
I can't. To get to the point, British Rail, it was meant to create a more efficient system of transportation. It did the exact opposite. So in Britain, what you had was back in the early 1900s, you had a dozen different railroad systems. And then they had this thing called the grouping, which basically forced them to merge into 4 separate systems. They were still private, but they were forced to merge. And then after World War II, they were all forced to again merge into British Rail, which was government owned and government funded. And there was a whole mess of things that happened in there, abandonments of rail lines, just a whole host of things that I could do an entire episode about. But the issue is British Rail had such a hard time actually being efficient and effective because they were constantly worried about politics. Yeah. That's the issue about government-run corporations is they have to, they are servitude to the whim of politicians of the time.
Yeah.
That's why we were talking about, Amtrak can't get funding constantly because they're subject to whatever person is in power. Exactly. Amtrak has an operating budget every year from Congress instead of, a corporation where they can change whatever they're doing and they get a different budget every year based on their own profits. The government is giving Amtrak a certain amount of money every single year, and it doesn't work because they can't actually invest in anything because they're going to be afraid that the next year the funding might run out. So here's the deal. If we're going to nationalize, we cannot do another Amtrak because, like I've said and stated multiple times, it doesn't work. Amtrak isn't working. If we're going to nationalize, the thing we need to focus on is we need to be a Conrail. We need to get to privatization as quickly as possible. Nationalize the railroads, break up the giant monopolies, make the railroads smaller. Because if anybody who's taken a basic economics class knows that the more companies you have in a sector, the more competitive it will be, innovation will be driven up, and those kind of things will get better. And smaller railroad companies, for people who are working in the industry, that smaller the railroad company is, usually the better they treat their employees, the more focus there is on actual service to the customer, because that's what small business owners like. They want to be seen as a good service. They don't care about, you don't have a corporate board telling them what to do. They don't have to worry about investors. They're literally just there to run a railroad, and that's what we need to focus on.
And in addition to that, we also need to start incentivizing R&D. So this would probably also have to come from the government, top down, right? But the problem with railroads right now as well is they keep and collect a majority of the profit share. It just kind of goes to the CEOs of corporations.
Yeah, no. The profit needs to go back into the railroad and it needs to be invested in infrastructure, in improving operations, in improving relations with customers, in improving employee pay. The problem is we have no system of incentivizing R&D. We have no system of incentivizing increase in production and increase in anything.
A better service.
Because, and that's the thing, that's what monopolies create. Monopolies create stagnation in an economy. It's not a perfect competition.
Generally worse service from
Yeah.
a monopoly. So ideally we could do this through a system of like tax breaks or grants. And that would also, if we were able to give grants to railroad companies, it might help us avoid strikes and problems with unions, because it would allow companies that are actually trying to improve their service and do research and development, it would allow them to pay off their workers without having to sacrifice all these new innovations they're trying to do. And that's in contrast to companies that are just they're paying off unions and they're just stagnating.
Yeah,
essentially.
actually, so I have an example for this. Back in this was the late 70s, there was a company out in the Midwest called the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific, and they were, for a long time, they were a large railroad, but they had always kind of had, like, just been on the edge of, kind of being in financial worry. They were always known as the one railroad too many in the Midwest. They kind of duplicated a lot of other lines, and by the 1970s, they were struggling. Like, they were in a bad position. Their track had been deferred maintenance for years. That's kind of the whole, like, their whole nickname was the fact that their track was so bad that, like, the locomotives would swirl back and forth, like, while going down the tracks. But they got a new, like, corporate structure in the late 70s. They did their best to try and fix the problems, and they kept improving track. They improved locomotives. They got new locomotives. They improved their service. And then the unions struck, because the unions had, like, a contract they had with the Rock Island had expired a few years prior. And they're like, we want a new contract, and we want all the money that you owe us from this contract if it had been applied when the old one expired. But the Rock Island literally said, hey, we don't have the money for you. We'll open our books so that way you can look at our books and verify that we don't have the money to pay you. And the union was like, no, we need our money. And then the whole railroad went bankrupt. So the union workers lost their jobs, and the railroad employees lost their jobs. And then, of course, the management had no railroad left.
Yeah,
like,
no one wins.
Yeah, that's the issue, is that when unions start... I don't have a problem with unions as a concept. I have a problem that they always seem to have the worst timing. They always seem to strike whenever a company is at its lowest. They never ask for anything. Like, obviously, in this specific instance of today with the Class 1s, the unions are asking for more pay at a time when the railroads are making, like, maximum profits, which I have no problem with that. Yeah. I take issue when what unions start asking for things when the railroads literally have nothing.
Ideally, if you had a government who actually acted in the interests of those workers, you could just bypass unions as a whole and ensure that those people got paid.
My opinion has always been that unions should be a necessity thing.
Exactly.
They shouldn't just be. You shouldn't have to be in a union to get paid well. Like,
they should be there for when there's actual workplace violations and people are getting hurt on the job and stuff like that, like workers' compensation, all that sort of stuff. It shouldn't just be like someone lobbying for more money, like an NFL agent.
Yeah, the system should be that the company wants to treat its workers well, so they don't need to unionize. And if an issue happens, then they unionize, and then they take care of the issue.
Yeah.
Whether that's they need to be paid more, they need more compensation, whatever it is, they take care of the issue when it comes up. They don't just constantly badger for more and more and more, because that is when the companies just fire everybody.
Yeah, and right now we have neither. We don't have heads of corporations who care about the workers at all. And we also have unions that are just bloated and are working to just secure as much money as possible. Neither of those things should really exist, in theory.
Yeah, it's just... The issue comes to the fact, like we said, back to the Friedman Doctrine, the idea that it's all, like these corporations have no actual responsibility to be moral. Like,
exactly. They have no responsibility to provide good service. They have no responsibility to treat their workers well. That used to be a point of pride because there were generally decent people in charge of some of these places.
No, that was the thing.
That was just luck, though.
There used to be railroads, like the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, like, had this whole thing where it was employee owned. Like, that was the railroad's whole thing, was it was employee owned. They treated their workers well. Same thing with Conrail once it was privatized. They were really good with the labor unions. Like, the thing is if you treat your workers well, then the unions don't have to exist.
Yeah.
If we had corporations that cared about their workers, then we wouldn't need unions. That wouldn't need to be a thing. And that's the system that we're trying to say needs to exist, because the only way we get out of this is by having people up at the top who care about their workers. Whether that means we have to nationalize the rail system, or we need to, invest in companies from the government, like give government money to companies that are, being productive and being innovative and treating their workers well. Whatever we need to do, we need to increase innovation, because when innovation increases, everything else benefits.
Yeah. Because, at this point, it's due to the fault of government intervention that caused a lot of this monopolistic stuff, just in general. In terms of the corporate world. But it also has to be government intervention to get us out of it, to some degree, at this point.
Yeah, at this point, there's nothing else that can... as much as I abhor government intervention.
I know.
That's the thing, is it caused this whole mess.
Yeah.
But we have to... It's like a double-edged sword. Like, you have to...
And it'll only work in some industries and in specific times, and it hurts the ANCAP in me to say this.
Yeah, exactly.
But we do need to use some drastic measures to get us out of this.
Drastic times call for drastic measures. We need to... That's the thing, is we need to fix the rail system. It needs to be fixed.
Yeah, it needs to be done right.
It's the most efficient form of transporting goods. And, if you believe in the whole climate change thing, which, I will not acknowledge that any further. Someday we'll have an episode on that, maybe.
We'll get to that.
If I deem it worthy. Regardless, they're efficient, they're effective, and for a long time, they were a source of national pride. They're a national asset, and maybe...
they're kind of a national disgrace.
Maybe, here's a thought, maybe if our railroads were better, we wouldn't have the I should say pro-labor president fighting against the labor.
Yeah. We haven't had a pro-labor government in a while. That's
a funny thing is
thing of the past.
The Democrats who say that they're pro-labor actually aren't pro-labor.
Yeah, we haven't had anything resembling pro-labor administration probably since FDR. I have my problems with FDR, but
he was pro-labor.
He was definitely pro-labor. I'll give him that.
I don't know. Anyway, that is my thoughts on the whole U.S. rail system. I appreciate you all listening to my rant about that. And if you'd like to hear more about the random things that I know about other things, make sure that you listen to the podcast, because that's what every single other week is. It's just us ranting about things.
Us talking.
Yeah. You could call us grifters if you wanted.
Subscribe here. Hit us up on Spotify. We got a Spotify.
Hit up our Instagram and our Twitter. Brutus is always posting memes on the Twitter. I'm on Instagram making people angry. So if you want to come support, or if you're a hater and you want to come yell at me in the comments, I will argue with you.
That'll be a good time.
Don't expect me to put much effort into it, but I will argue with you, and I will take the free interaction points. I think that's all that we have for this episode today. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks for listening, guys. I've been Brutus.
I've been Icarus. This is the Plead the Fifth podcast.
Later.
See y'all later.